I'm Nicole Arnold from Randolph Electric Membership Corporation in Asheboro, North Carolina. Welcome to Along Those Lines.
Power outages during large storms are unavoidable. Don't let your customers and staff struggle through another storm season with a subpar outage management system. Make sure you are prepared for the next large-scale outage event with MillSoft Outage Management Solutions.
Hi, everyone. This is a podcast about electric cooperatives, the work they do, and the challenges they face. I'm your host, Scott Hoffman. An unprecedented Arctic blast and winter storm that hit the Midwest and the South in February this year caused widespread power supply issues, rolling blackouts, and sustained outages. The event impacted multiple states, but Texas was hit the worst, with several days of outages, crippling power supply shortages, and nearly 200 deaths attributed to the storm. What happened in Texas, and why was it so much worse there? To help explain, we'll talk to Mike Williams. He's the CEO of Texas Electric Cooperatives. Later, we'll hear from Mark Jones. He's a fellow at the Hobby School of Public Affairs at the University of Houston, and he was part of a group that did a survey of Texas power consumers in the immediate aftermath of the storm that found some really interesting opinions about how the various providers in Texas responded to the event. Mike, welcome to the podcast. Thanks so much for coming on.
Of course. Glad to be here.
Okay, so for our listeners, they heard a lot about what happened in Texas, but what I want to get a sense of is what it looked like from the co-op perspective and how you all responded. So remind us what happened during that cold snap in the middle of February.
Well, let me just start out by saying I don't think any one person knows exactly what happened in any great detail, and there's certainly lots of opinions about why it happened and some of the causes and perhaps even some of the results from this storm that have now been translated into legislative action. Something that is worth noting about this storm was both the intensity and the duration. We've heard a lot about the polar vortex and particularly this storm, but it was cold, colder than it had been in a very long time, and it stayed cold for a very long time, which created situations, operational conditions that haven't existed in Texas for a long time, perhaps maybe ever. I know a lot of people refer to the 2011 weather event in Texas. A lot of similarities, and there was a lot of conversation about how to prevent that from happening again, particularly as it relates to weatherization. I think what was most frustrating about this winter event was the confusion about the way the market worked. As you know, not everybody is in agreement about the decisions that were made. I have no opinion about that, because we have different views within the co-op family. But there was a lot of frustration with how the energy market worked, how prices were set, and the outcome, the financial outcome from that. From a cooperative perspective, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, which essentially runs the grid, asked for rolling outages. And as an industry, we are careful to avoid the term blackout, but most of the media, use the term blackout, but it was rolling outages. A blackout is, I think, a more serious operational event that takes a long time to recover from. But our folks were challenged by the fact that they had a lot of critical circuits. And so while we were trying to do rolling outages, in some cases, there weren't enough circuits to rotate. And so some people were out of electricity for longer periods than they would have liked. But on balance, I think the electric co-ops at the distribution level in particular did an extraordinary job of keeping the lights on as much as they could. In fact, they were doing rolling outages over 30-minute intervals, which is, pretty amazing when you think about it. Now, not everybody liked that, but most people seem to prefer knowing that they were going to have electricity at least for 30 minutes or every hour at least. And that's the way that worked. Now, not everybody was as fortunate. One of the more challenging things, and I must say, I've got to hand it to the oil and gas industry. They've done a remarkable job of portraying themselves as performing extraordinarily well during this winter event. Now, I find that interesting because a lot of our electric cooperative G&Ts in Texas had generating resources that are ready, willing, and able to make electricity, but they couldn't get natural gas. So that was one of the more challenging things about this storm. Obviously, when it gets that cold for that long, there were clearly operational issues, but one of the most frustrating things, most challenging things, was not being able to get natural gas.
And what exactly happened? Did things just freeze up? Why was it so hard to get gas?
Well, unfortunately, I can remember all the way back to the 1970s when Texas ran out of natural gas. Not because we didn't make enough, but because we couldn't get it from where it was produced to where we needed it. We've always had a deliverability issue in Texas. So there's no shortage of gas, particularly from some of these more recent discoveries that were using fracking technology to produce oil and natural gas. But the thing that happened was they had issues with wellheads that froze. Some of them were on electric circuits that should have been identified as critical load, that the gas companies didn't submit 3 pages of paper that would have allowed the electric utility to say, okay, let's don't turn that one off because we need that one. They didn't know where they all were. I think that's something that will get addressed in a larger infrastructure supply chain legislation that is making its way through the Texas legislature right now. But then the other thing that happened after the fact was we couldn't get gas, and that gas that you could get was very, very expensive. So that has really created a long-term challenge for a lot of utilities in Texas, and unfortunately, particularly for electric co-ops.
And one of the things we heard either while it was going on or in the immediate aftermath was that the grid in Texas was literally within minutes of a catastrophic failure. Mike, can you give us a sense of what that actually means?
Well, it's a great question. I'm not an engineer, but I've been around this business now for about 35 years and worked for a lot of different utilities. And actually was on the ERCOT board early in my tenure here at the Statewide Association in Texas. And it is a very bad thing. Mm-hmm. What it means is that the system goes down. There's basically a cold start, or I think they refer to it more as a black start. And it's the kind of thing that takes days, maybe sometimes weeks, to actually get the whole system back up again. And it has a lot to do, I believe, with system harmonics. You can't just turn everything on and hope that it works. It has to come on in stages. And so, according to ERCOT, as you said, we were within minutes of that sort of catastrophic event. Unfortunately, it was avoided.
Yeah, I guess that was why the rolling blackouts were instituted, is because without that, you could still be in the dark now. And you've mentioned ERCOT a couple of times. Just to kind of get us up to speed, what exactly is it and what is it supposed to do?
Well, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas is basically the traffic cop for electron flow in Texas. And we have a somewhat unique market because we have retail competition, but we also have wholesale competition. Retail competition in some parts of the state, not necessarily in electric cooperative service areas or municipal areas. But the way the market works in ERCOT is every generator actually doesn't necessarily use their own electrons. And that's just the nature of physics anyway, but they bid their generation into the market and ERCOT sells it back out of the market. So basically they are there to ensure reliability, hence the name, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas. Although one of the things that has, I think, become into much sharper focus in Texas is this notion that, and I refer to it as the relentless pursuit of lowest cost and high reliability are likely to be mutually exclusive events. And so the Texas market has been all about, for good reason, lowest possible cost, and that's what ERCOT helps facilitate, is making sure that the lowest cost generation gets bid in, gets sent back out into the marketplace. But ERCOT has a fairly significant size board. It has ex officio members from the state regulatory agency that sit on that board. There's been a lot of criticism, as I think probably everyone knows, of ERCOT's management. And I believe the board will likely be reshaped as we come out of this legislative session. One of the criticisms was that it had some outside folks on the board. These are independent directors. The reality is finding independent directors that know anything about how things work are hard to find if they're truly independent inside your own state. But I think the state's going to try a little harder to do that. But ERCOT, again, is basically air traffic control or traffic cop for electrons flowing in and out of the system.
And one of the things I do want to talk about is we know Texas is a big wind state. Was it to blame?
Well, Texas has an extraordinary amount of wind. And I think anybody that knows even a little bit about how electric systems work know that intermittent resources are just that. They're intermittent. They're not dispatchable. So those intermittent resources, of course, include over 20,000 megawatts of wind in Texas, and I think now almost 10,000 megawatts of solar. I think there's at least another 20,000 megawatts in the pipeline. of wind in Texas. So it really is about having the appropriate proportions of these resources. I know there's a lot of criticism of the intermittent resources, and the reality was that they mostly were not on. And you can't make them run when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, as everyone knows. Were they mostly responsible for how serious the situation got? I think that's been overstated a little bit. I think there's an old saying, where I stand depends on where I sit. And if you don't like renewable resources and you don't like what the federal government has done to incent renewable resources, then you're probably going to look and suggest that maybe that's the primary problem. They clearly were part of the problem. If we only had thermal generation, I think it's pretty obvious that we wouldn't have the issues we had. But there were a lot of factors that contributed to the market failure. Maybe some of it was design, but clearly the ability to get gas from where we produce it to where we consume it was one of the major factors. And even some of the folks who had solid fuel plants had trouble with the coal piles freezing. So Again, going back to the weather, we've seen cold weather before, but you don't generally see cold weather in Texas. What you generally do is plan for the summers. But if you have a winter storm that is this cold for this long, even if you try to winterize, what do you winterize to? I suppose now the standard will be Winter Storm Uri.
You had said earlier that 2011 there was a similar event, 2018 a similar event. The lessons that were sort of learned at the time, what didn't get translated over, what didn't get put into practice that made this most recent event happen?
Well, I think they observed in the 2011 event that some additional weatherization would have been desirable and would have helped avoid some of the operational issues that we had in 2011. As it turns out, the Public Utility Commission of Texas was given the responsibility for ensuring that weatherization occurred. It turns out that enforcement, if you will, or the oversight the PUC was given wasn't particularly well executed. That there were probably a lot of situations where plants were not weatherized. And again, going back to this focus on lowest cost, when you're a low-cost market, you don't do anything you don't have to. You're going to do what you can to make sure your stuff runs most of the time, but you're not going to do any more than that probably, especially if you're for profit. Now, we'll say this for the co-ops. We had some extraordinary performance from some of our co-ops. They were on, they did everything they could, and they kept most of their generation on most of the time.
Yeah, and that leads very nicely to the next point. There's several bills moving through the legislature in Texas, and there's sort of a groundswell of desire to reform the system and make sure that the low-cost profit motive does not outweigh the ability to weather through storms like this. Talk about some of the pieces of legislation. What's the statewide doing to advocate, and what do you think the prospects are for these things to not only get passed and signed, but actually implemented?
Well, during a typical legislative session, there are lots of issues. What some people don't understand that don't work within the legislative arena is you only have so much ammunition. So we're focused on trying to make sure that not only good things happen, but bad things don't happen. In the electric space exclusively, though, there are bills that will give more focus to the weatherization efforts. I think the whole Public Utility Commission has been replaced now, at least the commissioners themselves. So these new commissioners are clearly going to dig in on what the utilities are doing, what they haven't done, what they need to do relative to weatherization. So that's one of the bills. One of the biggest issues for us, unfortunately, is the financial results from Winter Storm Uri. As I think everyone knows, we have one electric cooperative generation and transmission entity that is in bankruptcy, and they owe a considerable amount of money to the ERCOT market, and we have caused to have filed a couple pieces of legislation that have to do with securitization. Securitization is not a particularly exotic financial instrument, but it is one that essentially allows you to get off your balance sheet all these extraordinary costs that were incurred by some of our members. We have some distribution co-ops that got wholesale power bills because of the market disruption that are 3 times their average annual cost. You don't have to have a very sharp pencil to understand what that means to those utilities. They need something to give them some relief and to mitigate the financial impact on their members. So we are very focused on getting a couple securitization bills passed so they can do some off-balance sheet financing, free up their balance sheet to do the normal kind of financing that they do just to build out their system and operate their system.
Yeah. So going forward, as the head of the statewide, what are some of the things that you intend to advocate for to keep this from happening again? Do you think moving away from this heavily marketized system is something that has merit going forward, given what you've been through?
Well, we look for direction from our members, and particularly from our members who own generation. And I think that what we'd probably like to see as much as anything else is a little more reliability in the fuel delivery system in Texas. I mean, I really think, again, that the oil and gas industry has done a marvelous job of shifting the attention away from what they did or didn't do to the electric generators. I think that's something that's very important, and I think it's something that's on the mind of the legislature, and I think we certainly support that. Other sort of technology choices like storage, and particularly on-site fuel storage, I think that's something that will get some attention. But again, this is a very market-driven system down here, so you won't find a lot of support amongst the folks that are in charge, at least, for doing things that the market wouldn't do on their own anyway. So there'll still be a very bright light focused on cost, but obviously, balanced against reliability. But I think that we are very much interested in making sure that the market does work for our members. We want to make sure that we can get fuel. We've done our part, I think, in terms of weatherization. I think some believe that there maybe is more to do in terms of weatherization, given, again, the intensity and the duration of this last winter storm. But one of our primary focuses right now is getting the financial relief for our members in terms of the securitization. There are some who want other things in terms of financial relief, but the common ground, if you will, amongst the electric co-op family in Texas is let's get securitization passed so that these folks have a way to mitigate the financial consequences of Winter Storm Uri.
That's great. Mike, that was very informative and a great way to get us up to speed on exactly what happened. So I want to thank you so much for being on the podcast.
You're welcome. Glad to be here.
Next up, we'll hear about a study done of electric consumers in Texas right after the storm. But first, let's pause for a message from our sponsor.
In 2020, the U.S. endured 12 named tropical storms, 6 hurricanes, 1,010 confirmed tornadoes, and over 100,000 thunderstorms. Millsoft is passionate about outage management, and their track record during recent storms proves it. Millsoft customers also know that during times when an outage management system is needed most, Millsoft software is ready and available. And new for 2021, Millsoft has put the power of Millsoft OMS in the palm of your hand with Millsoft FieldSight, their most powerful mobile solution to date.
I'm Adam Elrod from Greystone Power in Hiram, Georgia. You're listening to Along Those Lines.
Welcome back. Mark Jones is a senior research fellow at the Hobby School of Public Affairs at the University of Houston. He was part of a group that quickly put a study in the field after the February storm to gauge consumer reactions to how their power providers performed. And it found that electric cooperatives in Texas earned the highest marks by far. He's going to tell us a little bit about that. Mark, thanks so much for being on the podcast.
My pleasure.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about the methodology of this study. Who did you talk to and what did you ask them?
Well, this occurred here in Texas. We had the tremendous winter storm of Valentine's Day where we lost power. And so we thought at the Hobby School it was very important to figure out what happened to Texans and what they thought about it. So we pretty quickly got into the field during the first 2 weeks of March, which is really important because you want to do this type of study when people's memories are fresh and they really do remember their experience. And so we did a survey of 1,500 a representative survey of 1,500 Texans inside that grid to look at how they prepared for the storm, what happened to them during the storm, what happened after the storm, what they think about policies, and how they would evaluate both their leaders as well as their local utility.
Okay, so really robust study and really soon after this event happened. So the emotions are fresh and the recollection is clear. So tell us about some of the top level findings that you came up with.
So the first was that a majority of these Texans lost power. So 69% lost power, 31% did not lose power. We in Texas, we have within the ERCOT grid, we have what we call the deregulated side of it and the regulated side of it. The deregulated side is where you have a utility that serves for transmission and distribution. That's Encore up in the northern part of the state. It's CenterPoint down here in Houston. It's American Electric Power down south and then parts of the north. And then like Texas, New Mexico Power and some small islands. Then there are dozens of companies that then commercialize and sell electricity using those grids. Then the other method we have is the regulated market. And in the regulated market, there are two principal actors. There are the municipal utilities, some of which are very small, like in Burnett, Texas, others which are quite large, Austin and San Antonio. And then we have the electric cooperatives, which are spread throughout the state, although there are a large portion of them in central Texas, is where they're there's a high concentration of them. And then we finally, in that regulated market, have a small, very sliver of it are served by private companies like Entergy in some parts north of Houston. We wanted to see sort of what happened in the market. And so what we found is if you ask people several questions about their local utility, you asked about the overall performance, about how well they manage rolling blackouts, and whether the power outages in your area were done in an equitable or inequitable way, what we found across the board is that the regulated market outperformed the deregulated market. So then we dove inside the regulated market, and we found that the reason why the regulated market outperformed the deregulated market was primarily due to electric cooperatives. If you ask consumers about the overall performance of their local utility during the power outages, a significantly higher percentage of consumers in electric cooperatives have a positive evaluation of the performance of the local utility than we find in any of the deregulated markets. That is, those run by Oncor or CenterPoint or American Electric Power. If you ask those same consumers about the management of rolling blackouts, you have a much more positive evaluation among people who are served by electric cooperatives than those that are served by Oncor, CenterPoint, or American Electric Power. And finally, if you ask people, okay, putting aside everything else, were these cuts done in an equitable manner? Electric cooperatives receive much higher ratings, significantly higher ratings, than people served by Oncor or CenterPoint or American Electric Power. So the overall conclusion we came to is that when you ask consumers who are served by electric cooperatives were much more satisfied and much more positive about their overall performance of their utility during the storm, the management of rolling blackouts during the storm, and the overall distribution of cutting power and having power on during the storm than was the case for the deregulated market and the people served by Oncor and CenterPoint and American Electric Power.
That's great. And based on what you know about co-ops sort of generally and what you know about how they reacted in this particular circumstance, why do you think that is? What exactly did they do differently than others?
One thing that's clear with elective cooperatives is that elective cooperatives are more concerned with what their consumers, who are also their bosses in many ways, think and how they're affected by power outages. And that's not the case for Oncor or CenterPoint or American Electric Power because they just serve for the distribution side of things. Other companies engage in the commercialization. So pretty much they're not affected at all by consumer sentiment being negative or positive. The cooperatives, though, I think care far more about their consumers, and therefore we're going to try to do the best job possible and perhaps not cut as many corners on weatherization as was the case with some of their more corporate commercial rivals. I think there's also greater trust among people served by cooperatives. So, one thing we'll want to look at is, was performance actually superior? We don't have the numbers to be able to look at that right now. There's at least some partial evidence that the electric cooperatives did do a better job. And so one of the reasons why people evaluated them as doing a better job is because they did do a better job. Another explanation, though, could be that even with them doing an equal job, because cooperatives have earned the trust of the people they serve, they're likely to be given the benefit of the doubt. That is, people trust them, people have a more positive opinion in general, and they don't believe that their cooperative is trying to screw them the way that many people believe that CenterPoint or Oncor or A&P are really only concerned about profit and they don't really care about their consumers. So even if the performance was equal, you may have people served by cooperatives have a more positive overall opinion regarding their cooperative and therefore are more likely to believe that they did their best, even if under trying circumstances.
Looking at your experience, you're sort of an expert in Texas politics, and in the aftermath of this, there's a lot of momentum to get new regulation, new policies in place that will sort of help keep this from happening again. Is there anything in your experience from this study, from your general experience, that people can learn from the results of the study and the way that cooperatives do business that might sort of inform those efforts to reform the system?
What's clear is that electric cooperatives outperform their commercial rivals. So the first thing you want to make sure is that nothing in this legislation adversely affects the cooperatives. And that's always a tough thing because in Texas, we're a very unique state in that we have one regular session of our legislature every 2 years. The one right now ends at the end of May, and they won't be discussing any of these issues again until January of 2023. So you want to make sure that it gets done right, and you want to make sure that the legislation that's passed in Austin this session, and legislation will be passed, doesn't do anything that adversely affects cooperatives. Even though cooperatives outperformed the commercial rivals, Encore and Centerpoint and American Electric Power have armies of lobbyists, and they spend millions and millions of dollars trying to massage the rules to benefit them in a way that could hurt cooperatives. Perhaps not on purpose, but that could be the outcome. So I would say that the first thing that you would want the Texas legislature to do is make sure that they do nothing with this legislation that is against the interest and adversely affects cooperatives, because the one shining spot that we had amidst this debacle in February were our cooperatives. That is, our cooperatives outperformed both the regulated municipal companies, but especially the unregulated private companies. And so you wouldn't want to do anything to harm that, because if anything, the cooperatives have the right idea. Now, I think one lesson we could gather from this is that there would be some advantages to returning to a more regulated market. The reality is in Texas, that isn't going to happen, both because of the sentiment of the majority in the legislature, but also because of the power of the lobbies of not only the distribution companies like Encore and Centerpoint and AEP, but also the dozens of private companies that now commercialize electricity in the deregulated market. So we're not going to go backwards, but I think what we would want to do is make sure that we don't do anything that harms cooperatives and makes the environment less conducive for the operation of cooperatives. Because if anything, we would want more cooperatives and more robust cooperatives, not less.
That's great. This fascinating study, and I really appreciate how robust it was and how quickly you guys got it in the field. Mark, thanks so much for coming on the podcast and sharing your insights on this.
No, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And thanks to you, our listeners, and to our sponsor, Millsoft. For more on this and other podcasts, visit electric.coop. Until next time, I'm Scott Hoffman.
I'm Marion McLemore from Flint Energies in Warner Robins, Georgia. Thanks for listening to Along Those Lines. Subscribe and rate us on your favorite podcast app.